Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Arell, and today I'm going to talk to you about mourning. The request of this topic comes from some of you in relationship to thinking about how we mourn loss or experience grief or work through grief when the loss is still present. So the idea that we have lost a friend, or we have lost an opportunity, or our life shifts and way of living prior to the present is experienced as some kind of loss. I think this can be extrapolated to think a little bit more broadly, like how we experienced COVID, for instance, and what was lost during the period of COVID. And then I'll offer one more thought before I go deeper into that in relationship to something Pauline Boss calls ambiguous loss. Pauline Boss has done a lot of work on ambiguous loss, and if what I'm about to say is interesting to you at all, I would really encourage you to read her books or go in to look at her videos because they're very helpful. The concept has to do generally with two scenarios, although it can be extrapolated to multiple scenarios. The first scenario, if you think about somebody with Alzheimer's disease, so they're present to you physically, but mentally and psychologically, they're not the same person as they were before. In the process of experiencing someone go through Alzheimer's, there is a profound loss, even though the person is still present. Their physicality is there, but their psychology, their emotional availability, their own presence and understanding the world around them is so disturbed that they're a different human. And the process of that can be extremely disconcerting and evoke a lot of grief, even though the person's still present. The opposite phenomenon of that is that a person has disappeared. So when you get cases of mass trauma or you get gross social issues around injustice, or say for instance the experience of kidnapping. So somebody is gone physically, but there is still a real psychological connection to them, and maybe even a question of whether they're alive or not. In both cases, we're not talking about grief related to death. We're talking about grief that erupts even when the loss is not so easily defined. So there's this mix of presence and absence that's hard to put your fingers on. And this is why Pauline Boss, or one reason why she calls it ambiguous loss. So let's go another step into this process, and I'll tell you an anecdote about my experience teaching during COVID and talk about that a little bit and where I see the world having evolved since COVID in relationship to loss. And then I'll get a little bit more specific to individual experiences. When I was teaching mostly chaplains and ministers who worked in nursing homes and hospital settings, teaching them about human development and psychological development, especially insofar as it's related to traumatic circumstances. Started in January, and so COVID pretty much started around March 16th, 17th, and that date is the marker of when New York City basically shut down. So I'm teaching chaplains in New York City about human development and trauma, and COVID strikes. Most of the students in that class were working with marginalized communities. Most of the students witnessed very high rates of death as a response to COVID. Most of the students got COVID. One of my students' brothers died of COVID. So I'm teaching this class in real time of all of this disruption, death, grief, and sadness. And I'm teaching it to people that still have to function at a high level because they're caretaking people that really need their help, nursing homes, for instance. I had to pivot quickly with how I structured the class. But for me, more than that, there was a requirement for me to suspend any grief that I was feeling and to help my students both manage these outrageous personal requirements and experiences with navigating intellectual information. And this is a conundrum that I notice in lots of situations where we have high levels of stress and arousal, which is this ability to balance cognitive skills, so thinking and learning and producing new knowledge or information, and emotional or affective stimulus that's really high. And that is really exhausting. So if we're thinking about loss in general, the amount of effort that goes into those two processes that those students put in that time during COVID, that equated to some loss for them. I don't know what it is for each of them because I didn't talk to them after the class was over, but I'm very certain that beyond losing congregants, people they were taking care of, family members, and time, there was a cost to their own lives in terms of maybe their health. So we can lose at various different levels, and I think COVID really encapsulates, if we want to use the term ambiguous loss, the idea that we can't quite put our finger on it, but there was a lot lost in that time period. You know, one of the things that I think happened as a result of that in society, and something that I've observed, but it's all anecdotal, so I have no data on this, although I'm sure there's data still emerging, is that period of time, especially for people living in urban areas where stay-at-home requirements were more rigorous, but I think it's I think it was global, not just local, in New York City particularly. So there's about a 2 to 3 year window where there was a lot of loss. And if I'm thinking about it in terms of my students, when we came back into the classroom, I think it was the juniors who really experienced the depth of that, because they came in as freshmen and their experience was cut short. So the normal things that happened during freshman year, solidifying friend groups, maybe figuring out what kind of major to be in, understanding the mechanisms about how university or college works, and I could go down the list. Those things were cut short. Then they were introduced to school as juniors, but their experience really was more like freshmen. However, the school, the system, the way that it's set up, had an expectation that they would function on the level of junior, but they didn't have the skill set or the knowledge base to function as juniors. So there was a real kind of reset that they had to do pretty quickly and think about their future, not addressing the fact that they'd lost 2 years. So I remember introducing this in class one day because I couldn't make sense of how so many of my juniors were really struggling with what they were doing. And as we started to talk about it, I can't tell you how many of the students ended up in tears. And not tears of deep grieving or hyper arousal, being dysregulated, but really just kind of being touched by the fact that there was a recognition and a realization that they actually had experienced real loss, that they lost 2 years of their development. Now, we can look at that loss from various different standpoints in terms of what age group we're considering, what health level the person was walking into COVID, coming out of COVID, so what was lost in relationship to health. So that now we have an example of a time loss, an adjustment lost in relationship development, loss in health. And there's so many things that we can look at related to what was lost during COVID. And I'm actually only now seeing people really come out of that and start to make changes in their lives, feel like, oh, they're energetic again. There's a future that can be explored, expressed, dove into. I'm not sure that people have really done a good look at what was lost. So I think it's worth thinking about what was lost during that period, because of if I use my students as an example, what can happen when something is mourned, even when it's ambiguous, and it doesn't have to do with the death of a loved one, for instance. Let's go back to the example of some of my students experiencing this release, and that's how I want you to think about it. So crying doesn't have to be always a hyperactive, spasmic, fear-based, or unuseful phenomenon. And so when you think about it, think about how somebody's breathing when they cry. So if it's a that kind of breath with the tears, then you're dealing with somebody who's not regulated, who needs to take some deep breaths to get access to, rather than a panic response or a fight, flight, or freeze response, something that's going to produce some kind of release. So tears that are produced when somebody is regulated or calm or is taking some deep breaths, so long kind of sobbing, that experience produces a different kind of chemical reaction than something that looks like it's hyperventilation or has fear involved in it. So we're going with this idea that the crying is going to produce some type of release. The students are mostly regulated, but they are experiencing a deep level of grief that's facilitating mourning. In this crying phenomenon, biologically, what happens is we have two hormonal responses, probably more than that, but let's go with these two. One is the release of oxytocin, and one is the release of endogenous opioids. Endogenous opioids are chemicals in the body that work kind of like endorphins, and they create a feeling of release. Maybe we could go so far as to say happiness, or provoke some sort of positive biological response in the body. Oxytocin is often called the love hormone. Now, there's lots to say about oxytocin, and I may do a video on oxytocin because it's a really fascinating phenomenon in relationship to when it evokes in the body. Crying can produce the release of oxytocin, and what that facilitates hormonally is the development of the building of relationships or the ability to have trust. So if you think about the biological and the psychological interrelationship of crying to hormonal release, you have the experience of loss or mourning, but crying, processing through that, actually creates a hormonal almost pathway for connection to someone else, right? So you're actually giving yourself the benefit of creating new through the act of crying. So what's difficult in working with people that really are experiencing intense levels of loss is that the dive into the loss or the mourning can feel pretty overwhelming. So it's really important to kind of dip your foot into that, consider it, feel it, and realize that you have other resourcing to help you through the process. But it's an incredible important thing to do. So I encourage everyone to think about whatever you're going through, whether it's a loss of a friend, whether somebody that you know has gotten sick and has changed in some way so they're not as available to you in the present as they were. Even think about what was lost during COVID and give yourself some time to really grieve that, because the release that grieving can give you is the possibility for new relationships.